It's been close to 2.5 months since Mass Effect Andromeda launched to near universal criticism, and the big question on everyone's mind is what the hell happened? Clearly something went awfully wrong behind the scenes, but what exactly has remained a complete mystery until now. The following information comes from website Kotaku in an article published by Jason Schreier. All credit goes to this man who spent 3 months investigating all this. So if you prefer to read articles, head over to Kotaku and show Jason some love. But if you prefer a paraphrased version in audio-visual format and would like to hear my take on all of this, then stick around. Still here? Great, let's not waste any time and dive right into it. Jason's article begins by detailing how much of the information seen in the article was obtained through conversations with nearly a dozen developers who worked on Andromeda. While talking to them, it very quickly became clear that Andromeda's development was, quote, turbulent and troubled, marred by a director change, multiple major rescopes, an understaffed animation team, technological challenges, communication issues, politics, a compressed timeline, and brutal crunch. While some of these problems aren't unusual in game development, Kotaku's Bioware sources felt as though Andromeda felt unusually difficult to develop for. What's more, while Mass Effect Andromeda was technically in development for 5 years, the bulk of the game was apparently created in just the latter 18 months. It all began back in 2012 with one simple goal for the 4th Mass Effect entry: to start fresh. This was a big reason for why Bioware decided to hand the project over to Montreal rather than the Mass Effect veterans over in Edmonton who developed the original trilogy. So with the next Mass Effect being helmed by Montreal, Casey Hudson and his Edmonton team began work on a brand new IP for Bioware codenamed Dylan, with the name allegedly coming from the fact that Casey Hudson wanted to make the Bob Dylan of video games with this new IP, one that would be remembered for years to come. Once all of this was determined, early conversations for the next Mass Effect began in 2012 as a team of directors, among them Casey Hudson, sat down and brainstormed ways to make the new entry feel distinct. This group included several veteran members of Bioware who essentially wanted to guide the project in its infancy before fully handing it over to Bioware Montreal. Among the ideas that were thrown around in these conversations was that there would be no Reaper threat, no Commander Shepard, and that the setting would be a new region in space as a means to start over. It was also decided that the next Mass Effect game would highlight the one feature that they didn't fully realize in Mass Effect 1, exploration. To that end, one early idea was to have the game be a prequel to the Mass Effect trilogy, set during the first Contact Wars when humans found and interacted with aliens for the first time. However, when they asked fans if they would prefer the next Mass Effect to take place before or after the original trilogy, the feedback they got was that most people wanted a sequel. They received the same feedback from focus groups as was internally within the team, and thus it was decided that the next Mass Effect would take place after the trilogy, not before. But one word that resonated among discussions was Contact, which became the codename for what would eventually become Mass Effect Andromeda. So that's it for 2012. From there, Project Contact entered pre-production by 2013, the phase in development where the team figured out the scope, workflow, and outline of what needs to be done. It was also at this point that Bioware hired a new director, Gerard Lehiani, who previously directed the Spider-Man games at an Activision-owned game studio called Beenox. According to his IMDb page, he wrote and directed Spider-Man: Edge of Time and wrote the Amazing Spider-Man game. It was actually this Lehiani fellow who presented the idea of the game taking place in Andromeda and the concept of colonists being sent to this new galaxy to discover habitable new planets in uncharted territory and repopulate, in case Shepard failed in his task to take down the Reapers back in the Milky Way. It was also Lehiani who proposed that the player would play the role of the Pathfinder, the one leading the quest to rebuild human civilization in the Andromeda galaxy. Lehiani also proposed that the game would allow players to explore hundreds of planets through algorithms that would allow for procedurally generated worlds not too dissimilar from those in No Man's Sky. So basically, the original goal with Andromeda was No Man's Sky with Bioware graphics and story, an idea that the team in Montreal was very excited about.
We're taking you to a whole new region of space.
This world is so vast that you can just kind of continue on to the horizon, and there's more and more experience for the player to enjoy.
Pick a planet across the other side of the galaxy and fly there and see what you'll discover.
Other proposed features that were similar to No Man's Sky include the ability to pilot a spaceship around the galaxy and land on planets seamlessly. Hell, they even built working prototypes for these systems, which even allowed players to hop into their Nomad from their ship, explore the planet on this vehicle, then get back on the ship and fly back out. The primary goal was to give players the feeling that they were really exploring space seamlessly. However, these ambitions created a number of problems, starting with the fact that Andromeda's team had no idea how they would implement an expansive, tight story with procedurally generated planets. It didn't help that some teams were understaffed and that there were technological difficulties along the way. BioWare's level designers tried using a tool called World Machine to procedurally generate planets and simulate erosion and realistic mountains. However, other teams struggled to figure out how to generate high-quality worlds without touching them up by hand. In other words, only one team figured out how to generate worlds procedurally, while the others struggled with this system. As if that wasn't enough, BioWare also faced the obstacle of using EA's Frostbite Engine, which, while very powerful, is also very difficult to use. To make matters worse, the Frostbite Engine was initially designed to make first-person shooter games like Battlefield. It wasn't until BioWare Edmonton made Dragon Age Inquisition that the studio got to modify the engine for RPG game mechanics and systems, which involved BioWare coders building almost everything from scratch. With some RPG tools in place after Inquisition's development, the Frostbite engine was then passed on to Montreal for Mass Effect Andromeda. However, engineers on the Andromeda team still had to design many features from scratch, including their animation rig, since the Frostbite engine they received did not come with an animation system right out of the box, making animation a particularly difficult endeavor for the team. The way one of Kotaku's BioWare sources described it was that if Unreal Engine is an SUV, slow but multifunctional, and the Unity engine a compact car, versatile but small and weak, then Frostbite is essentially a Formula One sports car. When it does something really well, it does it really well. But when it doesn't do something, it really just doesn't do it. So when they implement certain systems that fits Frostbite, the engine does really well, but when implementing something that it wasn't meant to do, it's just a huge struggle. Some of the things that they had difficulty with include increasing the max map size of 100 by 100 kilometers, implementing a streaming and save system, as well as other RPG mechanics that Andromeda required. The struggle essentially began with Inquisition, and it moved on to Andromeda, a source described. So to make a long story short, EA really fucked BioWare by making them use the Frostbite engine. This is an engine that they want to advertise and tout. They want to make it a buzzword essentially for their future titles. Beyond the technical struggles, there was also politics and conflicts within the studio that seeped into Andromeda's development. Several people from Andromeda's team apparently told Kotaku that whereas 2013 was one of the best years in their professional lives, brimming with possibilities, 2014 was one of their worst, brimming with politics. On one side, you had developers from Edmonton saying that the game was floundering in pre-production and lacking in a strong enough vision. On the other side, you had developers in Montreal thinking that Edmonton was trying to sabotage them and take ideas and staff for their own projects. This all eventually culminated in over a dozen people leaving BioWare Montreal for other studios by the end of 2014, and it was unclear whether they would be replaced. Apparently, some of the open positions were never filled, leaving the animation team in particular understaffed. Then there is the big one. On August 2014, Casey Hudson, the creative director of the original Mass Effect trilogy and lead guy over in Edmonton, left BioWare. Gerard Lehiani, the new director who was hired back in 2012, who had been leading Andromeda's story team, followed suit shortly after. From there, Bioware brought in veteran Mass Effect writer Mac Walters to act as new creative director for the project, who had a new vision for the game. Going back to technical struggles, the team also had trouble implementing some of the exciting ideas from a year ago. Things like combat and vehicle mechanics were shaping up quite nicely, but things like spaceflight and procedurally generated planets were causing problems. They got some prototypes up and running, but they found that driving around procedurally generated planets was repetitive and simply not fun. The end result was that Andromeda went out of pre-production in a premature state. A lot of things just weren't ready for full production. Certain tools and pipelines weren't where they're supposed to be, and they hadn't even finished building what game developers call a vertical slice, a chunk of the game that serves as proof of concept for everything else to follow. They hadn't even decided if they should continue refining the procedurally generated planet system, or if they should execute their backup plan and just go back to the old galaxy map system and fill those with more handmade planets. By summer 2015, the team realized that while they had some really good prototypes for systems like seamless spaceflight, they couldn't find a way to implement them and make them fun. It was at this point that the reality of their situation finally kicked in, forcing them to make cuts in these areas. By the end of 2015, they finally decided to cut both spaceflight and landing on procedurally generated planets. They finally decided to rescope. I should point out that aspects of the old, more ambitious space travel system can be seen in Andromeda's E3 2015 trailer. If you've played Andromeda, then I'm sure you're well aware that nothing like this made it into the final game. Anyway, with rescoping in mind, Bioware began by cutting down from hundreds of procedurally generated planets to 30 with procedurally generated terrain, but with handcrafted content. Then, that number dwindled down to 7 planets. Now, rescoping is not an uncommon part of game development, but they usually happen in pre-production. According to one of Kotaku's sources, Andromeda's major cuts happened way too late, stating that the team tried too hard to execute a game that was not doable. The result? Mechanics like combat and driving proceeded smoothly, while content like story, levels, and cinematics lagged way behind. Falls in line with the pros and cons of the final game when you think about it. Another logistic nightmare for Andromeda's development team was collaboration across different time zones. Having staff scattered across Edmonton, Austin, and Montreal meant that even the most basic tasks took way longer to execute than they should, taking valuable time away from development. Not to mention that outsourcing to studios in South Africa and Vancouver only compounded this problem. This kind of international coordination was simply something that Bioware was not equipped to handle. So you got indecision, technical problems, politics left and right, and just a lack of organization. So with all of this shit hitting the fan, Bioware Montreal had no choice but to ramp up production, shift resources, and push forward if they wanted to finish the game on time. But there was another problem. With so much of the development so far having focused on high-level ideas, things like story and characters had been put on hold for a while and reworked. As one of Kotaku sources put it, what you see in the final game is writing that has been done in the past 2 years rather than the full 5 years of writing. The writing team, writing the characters and everything, was unleashed too late just because of too many discussions about the high-level direction. So for those wondering how so much of Andromeda's writing, characters, and dialogue ended up being so lackluster, there is your answer. Now, apparently it wasn't just story that got made in the final stretches of the game. The bulk of the game was pretty much developed from the end of 2015 to March 2017. That's right, folks. The trailer we saw at E3 2015, it might as well have been a conceptual trailer like how Final Fantasy Versus 13's trailer was to Final Fantasy 15. You can imagine the kind of crunch time Bioware Montreal's team faced, with sources describing it as some of the worst, if not the worst, they have ever experienced. To make matters worse for crunch time, Kotaku sources described what they called regression. Normally, the final months of a game's development is a phase in which a game is polished and fine-tuned, and it's in these last months that a game really comes together and becomes significantly better. But for Andromeda, it seemed like everything just kept regressing in these last few months. They would create something, have it bug tested and approved, and just as they're about to move to the next thing, before they knew it, it would fall apart, in no small part to do with the fact that the game only came together as a rush job in its last year and a half. Jason noted that an example of regression could be the leaked alpha footage, which looks markedly better than the final results. Is a topic that I myself discussed a while back in a separate video. One of Kotaku's Bioware sources noted that while it's not unusual for games to receive graphical downgrades during development, Andromeda was a special case because regression was happening so late in its development cycle. It was the opposite of what should be happening, which is that the game should be coming together and getting better. And in the final few months of the game's development, the teams that were hit the hardest were effects, cinematics, and audio, also known as the downstream teams. They are essentially the last ones to touch up the game, and with the game being so behind schedule, all the work mounted at once for them only months before launch. In these final months, a few developers noted that there was a lingering effect of hopelessness, with others saying that it was the most challenging project they had ever faced, probably for all the wrong reasons. One quote in particular from an Andromeda developer is very telling of the harrowing experience. They said, "For the last few months of the game, we spent most of our effort just trying to keep it together rather than polishing, just trying to stay ahead of how quickly it was falling apart." Jesus. Kotaku's article then shifted to the topic of animation, the headline of Andromeda's issues, the results of which were a combination of many things in a turbulent development cycle. One of the biggest contributing factors to poor animations early on was indecision and lack of leadership. During pre-production in 2013 and 2014, they simply could not decide on what technology to use for facial animations. Some wanted to use a technology from an Egyptian company called Snappers, who could create beautiful facial animations, but there were concerns about how to implement those animations into Frostbite and how they would scale across the whole game. Others wanted to use a program called Faceware, developed by EA in-house, but there were those who argued that it just wasn't good enough, and this kind of back and forth went on for a while. As for lip sync, like the original Mass Effect trilogy, the technology used is called FaceFX, which is apparently a fairly common program that interprets sound and automatically produces animated lip movement. These programs are essentially used to help animators handle the workload that comes with animating hundreds of NPCs. In most cases, only the more important scenes are touched up by hand, while the lesser scenes may be fully automated. However, Andromeda seemingly relied far too heavily on the automated technology because of their time constraints due to inefficient use of time. Another critical juncture for Andromeda's lackluster animations was during pre-production when Bioware decided to switch animation programs from 3D Studio Max to Maya. The result was that animators lost a ton of work during the transition. As one developer described it, they had to throw their work out because they used a red pen instead of a blue pen. Development hell continued for the animators as, even after Andromeda shifted from pre-production to full production, the tech for facial animation had not been locked in. By 2014, facial animation was flagged as one of the major risks of the project. To make matters worse, the animation team remained understaffed throughout the game's entire development. One of Kotaku's Bioware sources touted manpower, or the lack thereof, as the biggest problem for Andromeda's animations. Eventually, Bioware had no choice but to outsource a fair amount of Bioware cinematics to studios across the globe: Russia, China, India, and more. It didn't help that the story and writing wasn't locked down until very late in the process, which made it very hard to storyboard and determine beforehand how many of the game scenes would look like before animation work began. So you take all these issues, the lack of leadership, the arguments, the indecisions, technological incompatibilities, the lack of manpower in the animation department, mix it all together in a bowl, and you've got a recipe for disaster. Eventually, Bioware Montreal managed to put the game together, loosely speaking, and shortly before the game's launch, they sent early builds of the game to mock reviewers. For those who don't know what mock reviewers are, they essentially offer private, early assessments of a game and predict a Metacritic score. When the mock reviews came back, Bioware leads were relieved to find that the expected score came back in the range of the low to mid-80s. They thought this was good enough. With this range of a score, Bioware could regroup and build a much better sequel. However, after the game launched in early access on March 16th, well, I don't think that's a story I need to recount. That's when the gifs of the game's bugs and laughable facial animations, that's when the anger, the disappointment began. And for the final devastating blow, the Metascore that came back after the game launched was in the low 70s, far lower than the mock reviews anticipated. And that sealed Bioware Montreal's fate. Upper management decided they would scale down Montreal and that Mass Effect would be put on hold for a while, with no hope for an Andromeda sequel. Focus has now shifted towards Bioware's other games, namely the new IP codenamed Dylan and the next Dragon Age game. To conclude the article, Kotaku presented one last quote from an Andromeda developer. At a very high level, even though the game was in development for 5 years, Mass Effect Andromeda was just trying to do too much with too few resources. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the rise and fall of Bioware Montreal and Mass Effect Andromeda, as detailed by Kotaku's very own Jason Schreier. Wow. Where to begin? Suddenly, Andromeda's bizarrely disastrous launch makes so much more sense now, doesn't it? You know, in some ways, Mass Effect Andromeda is an incredible feat. Not an incredible game, an incredible feat. What I mean is, the fact that Mass Effect Andromeda came together at all in the hellhole that it was developed in is almost impressive. You know what two games this whole debacle reminds me of? Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance and Final Fantasy XV. Indulge me for a bit. If you recall, Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance was originally announced as Metal Gear Solid Rising, and was being developed by younger members of the old Kojima Productions. They had this idea of being able to cut anything in any way from any direction and any angle with Raiden's sword. However, somewhere along the way, the team struggled to find ways to implement their cut-anything mechanic into a cohesive game. So after a while, Kojima decided to can the game for the time being because it was going nowhere, and thus Metal Gear Solid Rising remained in development limbo for some time. Then there's Final Fantasy XV, a tale as old as time. The game was first announced as Final Fantasy Versus 13 through a CGI trailer that showed ideas and concepts that the developers had in mind for this game. But their overambition, their lack of decisiveness and direction, as well as their inability to bring their ideas to fruition, resulted in a decade-long development cycle. If you think about it, Mass Effect Andromeda's struggles aren't too dissimilar from these two games. It started out with exciting and ambitious high-level concepts like procedurally generated planets and seamless space travel, but poor technical choices, overambition, indecision, lack of foresight, poor management, absence of leadership, and a lack of cohesive vision halted and crippled progress significantly. But that's where the similarities end. Unlike Andromeda, Metal Gear Rising and Final Fantasy XV eventually managed to correct course before it was too late. With Metal Gear Rising, Kojima reached out to Platinum to help them finish the game. And with Final Fantasy XV, they got a new director, they changed the game's direction into something more feasible, and they delayed the game as needed. 10 years is a ridiculous amount of time to wait for a game, but at least they got it right in the end. The developers of both of these games swallowed their pride, took responsibility, and did what they needed to do to deliver their product. As a result, despite trials and tribulations, both games turned out to be pretty good and they were generally well received. With Andromeda, on the other hand, it feels like the game's writers, directors, and upper management just steered the game into a collision course and just kept going until it was too late to veer away. And you got people like Casey Hudson who saw this coming and just jumped ship before the crash happened. And good thing that he did, because technical mishaps, internal conflicts, indecisiveness, arguments, and politics within both the Montreal and Edmonton branches of Bioware continued to plague Andromeda's development for years, eventually putting the project irreparably behind schedule. Now, EA could have intervened and pushed back the release date, but of course, they would much rather ship a broken product early than launch a polished game late. So with all said and done and all things considered, Andromeda's end results are hardly surprising. More surprising after reading Kotaku's article is again that the game came together at all, that it actually functions on some level even if it lacks polish. Like, if I would have read Kotaku's article first before the game launched, I would have assumed that this game was just gonna be unplayable, a complete disaster. But it shipped in a playable, albeit laughable state. What has especially become abundantly clear to me after reading Kotaku's article is that Mass Effect Andromeda's disastrous launch isn't just Bioware Montreal's fault. All of Bioware and EA had a part to play in crafting this perfect storm. A lot of this especially had to do with poor management and poor decisions from the higher-ups. And the ones who ended up suffering most are the foot soldiers, people like the animators. I feel like the animation team in particular really got fucked over on this one. But yeah, I mean, what else is there to say other than let this serve as a cautionary tale for future game developers? This is what happens when too many people are taking charge, which means that no one's taking charge. When people start letting pride get in the way of their collective end goals, and when a studio chews on far more than they can swallow. Anyway, there you go, folks. Everything you need to know about Mass Effect Andromeda's troubled development history. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoy my content, consider supporting me on Patreon so we can remain independent from third-party sponsorship and corporate interference. And to be further updated on all things Bioware, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.